Hello, I'm Penny Thornton and welcome to my astrology channel. And I'm going to be talking on this video about the next 6 months, and that's the period between about the 21st of June right through to the end of December 2020. And there's two reasons I decided to do this. The first one was that at the start of the year, I wrote a year ahead forecast for all the signs, and it certainly seemed to be a very helpful guide. People found it very helpful. And so I decided after this monumental half year we've been through since January that we were well overdue for an update, really reflecting on what's gone before, because we now have such a great understanding of what the really important configurations were about, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction and the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. We've had some very direct results from those particular influences. And so now, as we come into the second half of the year, we're going to be looking at how those influences are going to shape up during these next 6 months. Now, what I've done is to do a forecast for all 12 signs, and you'll find that on my website, and it's a written forecast, and it's very detailed. And I've also done a 6-month audio as well. So each sign of the zodiac will be very well served, because obviously on this video, I'm going to talk mainly about what's coming up in a general sense, although I will be looking at one particular thing from the perspective of all 12 signs. So all these things will be up on my website. It should be on the 21st of June, maybe a couple of days later, really depends where you are in the world. And also we have had a few problems with servers for some reason, some parts of the world getting the things that I upload every week right away, and others waiting 24 hours, and there is really no explanation for that. So without more ado, let me go on with the 6 months that we have ahead. Now, the 6 months kicks off really with the solar eclipse in Cancer on the 21st of June. There's another eclipse 2 weeks later on the 5th of July, and that eclipse is almost a mirror image of the one we had on the 11th of January, just prior to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. So it really does fit into this idea that we're a year in two halves. And I want to go back a little bit and talk about the Saturn-Pluto conjunction and the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, because they are with us in the second half of the year. And they're probably going to show us some really much more dramatic and important things about what they mean to us. Now, if you remember, as we entered the 2020, I talked about the idea of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction being about reformation. Because one of the things we've seen in history, every time we look back at when Saturn and Pluto were conjunct, and they're conjunct every 35, 33, 36 years, it depends on the movements of both those planets. And we note what was really the pattern of the times and how they fit in with what we understand about the natures or the properties of those planets. And with Pluto, we get elimination and we get transformation. And with Saturn, we get restriction. And we're also looking at institutions that Saturn is very responsible for. So we're looking at things like the military, government, the treasury. We're looking at the police force, leadership generally. And so we can see how, when we put these keywords together, transformation, elimination, and we think also of the kind of industries that I've just talked about, and we can see how much these recent months have transformed those things. And of course, they were transformed by what I would call this act of God, the coronavirus that came into our midst, really probably came in a little bit earlier than January, but the world began to be much more aware of it by the time we got into January. So this kind of understanding that Saturn and Pluto have been responsible for so many adjustments, but also Saturn-Pluto conjunctions, talking about reformation and reformation, is often about boundaries, Saturn being boundaries. And in times past, we've seen countries being, changing their boundaries, often, perhaps in the wake of war or conflict. And initially, it didn't seem as though very much to do with the changing of boundaries or that kind of reformation and reformation had really occurred in this, as we entered 2020. But my goodness, it's with us right now. I want to think really in particular about China, because China is building up atolls, these little tiny mounds of earth and stone, if you like, building them into much larger entities and planting military bases on them. So it's extending its property in the South China Seas. It's also extending its power over Hong Kong, bringing it into the motherland, so to speak, in its legislation. But last but not least, and in recent weeks, we've seen China making an incursion into Indian territory on the borders of Tibet and India. And, they're now, at the time that I'm recording this video, they're about 60 square kilometers into Indian land. So we can see how boundaries are being reformed very much by China. And I also want to think about other kinds of reformations and reforming. And we're thinking really about what's happened in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. Immediately, this call for the reformation of the police. And that has spawned similar kind of protests and developments and evolutions, if you like, across the world. So here we see the action of Saturn and Pluto together. Now, with Jupiter and Pluto, this was always aimed much more at the economy, at the global economy. Again, because we've seen patterns beforehand. Every 12 or 13 years, we see economic plunges and certainly economic uncertainty. So we knew that perhaps these two matters were related. Saturn, Pluto, Jupiter, Pluto, maybe one thing kicked off the rest. And of course, we know that in the wake of the coronavirus and all the lockdowns we experienced, business industry suffered in a complete transformation in all corners of the world. And we saw markets plunge at that point. Now, they have recovered a little bit as we saw them climbing back, giving people the confidence to think we were on our way back into, sort of normality. But in a couple of days before I'm recording this video to you, they plunged again, with the realization really that the coronavirus hadn't gone away at all. It's still very much with us. And that is how we begin our 6 months that are coming up. And what I've done here is I've had a look really at the things that I want to point out that are going to be important over these next 6 months, the dates, the times in general. I'm going to spend a huge amount of time on them, but just so that you can make a note of them in your diary. So we've already talked about the solar eclipse on the 21st of June, and eclipses are always game changers. And of course, I've talked about these things on my videos about eclipses, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. But what we also find in the June period is on the 28th of June, Mars comes into Aries. Now, Mars usually changes signs every 6 weeks or so. So we all get some kind of flavor of Mars throughout an 18-month period. But not this time. Mars enters Aries on the 28th of June, and it's going to be with us all the way through till January of 2021. And the important thing about this is it would be in the sign of Aries, which of course is its own sign. So it's a very dynamic Mars. This is Mars on steroids. This is all full power Mars. So we get action, we get drive, we get a tremendous drive to build the economy, to build back industry, to, create something out of the carnage that we've experienced in the previous 6 months. But Mars is also the warlord, if you like, of the planets. So we have a much greater chance of having some serious conflicts during these next 6 months. And every time Mars hooks up to Pluto and to Jupiter and to Saturn, and it's going to do this 3 times during the course of these next 6 months. Those kind of flashpoints are going to occur, and I'm going to give you the dates and times when that's possible. Now, also, as we get to the very end of June, the 30th of June, Jupiter and Pluto conjoin for the second time. The first time they did this was in April the 5th. So now we have them both retrograde on the 30th of June. And we really want to watch the economy at this point. The Jupiter-Pluto conjunction is a boom-bust phenomenon. We see things boom and expand, and we see them bust, a bit like the bubbles that we've experienced in the past, the dot-com bubble, for instance. So we have to be very, very wary of the economy as we go through this next 6 months, because it might be tempting to think, hey, we're recovering, so investments can go back. But if you are an investor and you're listening to me, I would advise you to be very, very cautious. Err on the side of caution, and you're probably better out of the market than you are in it, because it will be very unstable. And we want to look at what's going on around the end of June, because that's going to give us some market guidance. Now, as we come into July, the 5th of July brings this lunar eclipse. Again, I've talked a lot about this on a previous video, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it here. But what does happen this time, in a similar way as we started off the year, the 11th of January, followed by the Saturn-Pluto conjunction and the Sun and Mercury going over that conjunction, as we come into July and the middle of July, about the 15th, we have the Sun right at the opposite point of the zodiac to Pluto, and also to Saturn, and also to Jupiter. So we get a kind of return. We get to have a, not exactly deja vu all over again, but in our personal lives, we can have a look and see if there's been progress and development, and we can check these 2 time periods and think what reference and echoes they have and how we can put that to good use. And we're also going to see it in world affairs as well. Now, the other date I want to mention in July is going to be the 20th of July. And the reason for that is that there is a new moon. And this new moon is the very end of the sign of Cancer. And it's right at the opposite point of the zodiac to Saturn. And this is giving mixed signals, because when you put the sun and moon at the opposite point of the zodiac to Saturn, you get a feeling of closing of chapters and endings and, a line being drawn in the sand. But a new moon is always about new beginnings. So we're having a kind of, as I say, a mixed message being given. But it will be an important time. And again, for you, especially if you have a birthday around that time, that idea of drawing a line in the sand between what has gone before and what is going to come next is really very important. Now into August, and I'm looking at the full moon of August on the 3rd of August. This is going to be in Aquarius. And this is a significant one because it comes at the same time as a Mercury-Saturn opposition. So Saturn keeps taking a look in every time we get some of the more dynamic kind of planetary events. So again, we can see this is a time of assessment. And particularly if you're a Leo or an Aquarian, this is about closure and completion. It could be to do with a relationship or relationships plural. But if we are conscious of what these full moon, new moons mean to us in the sense of beginning something or ending something, we can do what's appropriate at the time. We can live in harmony with our astrology. Now, also in August, in between the 13th and about the 25th, we have Mars, as I warned, coming into contact with both Pluto and with Saturn. This is going to be a really tough period. And I think we want to watch flashpoints out there in the world, maybe China and India at this point. It's going to get a little bit sticky. And maybe we'll want to look at Hong Kong at this point. Again, China in the center. And of course, all our political hotspots, whether it's Great Britain and Brexit, whether it's the election coming up with Trump and the USA, these are really going to be very important crisis points, really. And of course, out of crisis comes growth and new ways forward, as I always say. If we come to September, quite a few important dates in September. We've got a full moon in Pisces. And I tell you why that one's important. That happens on the 2nd of September. On the 9th, we have Mars entering or turning stationary retrograde. And on the 11th, we have the Sun in opposition to Neptune. And why this is important is that in the same period in March, where we had the full moon, we had the Sun in Pisces, moon in Virgo. Now we have it the other way around. We have the Sun in Virgo, moon in Pisces, with Neptune involved. And this turned out to be a very important juncture for the coronavirus. It was at this point, it was officially declared a pandemic. So we can see there are going to be some other important developments around this time. Now, these don't necessarily have to be bad developments. These developments can be positive because it is the coronavirus story. And at some point, we are going to make progress with vaccines. We are going to make progress with medications that can help ease the coronavirus. So let's look at that point of September for giving us some good news or a sense of maybe a closure here and there. But of course, we've also got to bear in mind that this coronavirus is a fearsome enemy, and it isn't going away anytime soon and won't really go away until we get a vaccine. So there are going to be periods of this time where the news coming in of the various countries which are experiencing a lot of trouble with the coronavirus, we're going to perhaps find some serious stories around this time. Two more things that are important in September. Jupiter turns direct, is going to turn direct on the 13th, and on the 29th, Saturn turns direct. Now, Saturn is particularly important here because it means it's starting the final lap of its shadow cycle, which it will finish towards, well, the mid to late period of January. So we can see that a lot of the things that have gone on in the preceding periods, the preceding months, are going to now either be resolved or we're going to see their impact, what they really mean. And we'll look at that in global situations, and we'll look at that in our personal lives as well. So it's always useful to think about Saturn, and I've done quite a lot of work on my videos about where Saturn is in your chart and how to really deal with this planet, because it's all about strengthening weaknesses. It's about paying attention to what we find difficult and challenging, what we fear actually, and how important it is for us to embrace Saturn so that we can find more resources with which to deal with all our personal issues that we find in life. Coming to October, now, I think about out of all the months that we have ahead of us in these 6, October is probably going to be the most challenging of all. Pluto turns direct on the 4th, Mars squares Pluto on the 9th, and on the 13th, we have the Sun oppositioning Mars, and of course it's retrograde at that period, and squaring Pluto. I'm going to go quickly through this because Mercury turns retrograde also in October, turns retrograde on the 14th. And on the 31st, we have this mighty new moon, full moon, which is conjunct Uranus. In other words, the Sun is in Scorpio, the moon is in Taurus, and it's conjunct Uranus. And this is very near the USA election. So I think you're going to find a lot of things going on in this period of October that are going to create a lot of stress, for one thing, but also potentially going to change the shape of US politics as we come to that mid to late October period. November, what do I want to point out? I want to point out the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, which happens on the 12th of November. This is the third and final time. And often it's like third time lucky, isn't it? You know, it takes until the third time something happens or planets conjoin or make their aspect that we really see the full effects. So if by any chance you've been investing in the economy and you've been sucked into the idea that just to hang on in there because it'll all go all right, I think we need to look at that period of November, because I think reality sets in really in terms of what we really face with all the economic hurdles that we've got to get over. So I don't want to keep on talking about the economy, but I think, even if the most important thing in life is love and who we love and people and humanity, which it is, we've all got to earn a living. We've all got to put bread on the table. And so the economy in the larger context is important to us all. There's also a lunar eclipse in November, so put the 30th of November in your diaries, your astro diaries. This is in the sign of Gemini. The sun is in Sagittarius, the moon is in Gemini. And so this is terribly important for the mutable signs, Gemini, Sagittarius, Pisces, and Virgo. And again, I've spent time talking about this eclipse on my previous videos, and actually a little bit nearer the time, I'm going to do a lot more work on this, because as we get into December, we have a total solar eclipse, and that's going to be on the 14th of December, another date for your diary. And again, I'm going to go into this in a little bit more detail, a little closer to the time. But I think what happens with solar eclipses is that information comes to light. We think about what happens with an eclipse in that the one planet passes, or one solar body, lunar body passes in front of another, so it's in shadow. And we either find things being suppressed at the time of an eclipse, so that comes out later, or we find what has already been eclipsed or in shadow coming into the forum. So that's going to be a huge time for, chickens coming home to roost, finding out what's been going on in dark corners. But of course, we can look at that in terms of ourselves. And again, I will talk about this more nearer the time. For Sagittarians in particular, well, that is a brand new chapter. And it has a lot to do with getting rid of what's been in the shadows, looking at it, throwing it away, dealing with it, and then moving forward into a new era. 2 other dates for December that are very significant. We've got the 17th of December, Saturn finally into Aquarius. Again, I've done a video on this too. And then 2 days later, on the 19th of December, Jupiter enters Aquarius. And that's going to give such a boost to Aquarians. It's also going to give a boost to the other fixed signs. So that's Leo and Taurus and Scorpio. Again, something I'll be talking about in a little bit more detail. But that's the 6 months in terms of the big moments. What I want to talk about a little bit more before I end this video is Mars. The idea that Mars is a very dynamic influence. And as I said at the beginning of this video, things get moving with Mars, but they also get a little conflict-ridden. And I think what we need to think of in our own personal lives is that while we do want to get behind things and we do want to take a stand, think of all those protests that have gone on. We're going to see far more of those protests with Mars in Aries. And perhaps in our own life, we need to protest some of the conditions we've been living with. And we'll find that in our personal lives. Unfair treatment in the office, maybe. Perhaps partnerships being unfair, as they often are, standing up for ourselves. And also going out for what we believe in and what we truly want to attain. That's how Mars in Aries will help us in each and every different way. But what we also have to be aware of with Mars is burnout. Sometimes when we are doing too much, trying too hard, burning the candle at both ends, doing too much sport, even doing too much exercise, is that we pull a muscle, we hurt ourselves, we burn out. And so I think we have to recognize when we're getting to that point and pull back, because what also happens when we get stressed out and we do too much and we're reaching near burnout, we tend to be difficult to live with. We tend to get into arguments with people. So there is quite a lot more conflict in our personal lives when we've got Mars in this really dynamic sign. And of course, the idea of conflict in terms of politics, we are going to see some rough rides. Is going to be much more uproar in terms of governments and parliaments and senates and congresses. There's going to be a lot more uproar. I think that's a good word. And of course, all of it in a sense to get things right. We've got to remember that, in astrology, when things come to crisis point, it's there so that we can do something about it. But yes, it's going to be quite a hearty and feisty and perhaps, yes, a confrontational few months that lie ahead. So, of course, I will take you through it as I do in my videos every couple of weeks. But hopefully, that's given you a kind of overview of what it is. And again, if you want a little bit more specific about what it means for your sign, I urge you to visit my website where it's all written down, and also on my audios for the next 6 months, where you'll get a very much more in-depth view personally. So thank you for watching, and I look forward to talking to you some more in my next video. Bye for now.